There is a crowd of people dancing madly. They have been for days. Music is playing in the background. They convulse on the ground, cover themselves in mud, and swing and dance around until many of them collapse from exhaustion. This is not Bonnaroo or Woodstock or Burning Man. It's medieval Europe. For a few hundred years, a series of dancing plagues ripped through modern-day Italy and Germany. These mad dances have puzzled historians for centuries. Welcome back to Weirdly Interesting. Today, we're exploring the weird and wild medieval dancing plagues. Dance Revolution. One day in July of 1518, a woman named Frau Troffea stepped out of her house in Strasbourg, Alsace, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, now modern-day France. She stepped out of her house and started dancing. She wasn't dancing to music. She seemed to be dancing to nothing, dancing madly, possessed, flailing and spinning around wildly. It was contagious. More and more people joined her. By some accounts, as many as 400 people ended up hopping on the bandwagon. It lasted for weeks. Churchgoers were horrified. Some thought the revelers were possessed by the devil. Others were simply shocked by the unhinged maniacal nature of the whole thing. It wasn't the first time this kind of dancing broke out in medieval Europe. Accounts of dancing plagues in some form date back to the 7th century. One of the first big ones came 150 years earlier in Aachen, also part of the Holy Roman Empire near what's now Cologne, Germany. There, a similar frenzy broke out. Historians call it choreomania. There was apparently no rhyme or rhythm to the dancing, just a manic, writhing swarm of people that grew and grew. The revelers had originally come together to dance before the altar of the Virgin Mary. There are other accounts of dancers calling out the name of Saint John the Baptist, and so the dancing plague has also been called St. John's Dance. In any event, the wild dancing in Aachen eventually spread to a forest in Trier, some 120 miles south. There, reports of wild parties, people crawling around on their stomachs, and just generally acting like they were possessed by the spirit of some bacchanalian spirit set on sending them straight to the afterlife via death by dance-induced exhaustion. Many other cases preceded and followed both the 1374 and 1518 events. A group of children danced some 12 miles between towns in central Germany, inspiring the Pied Piper story. Another account around the same time involved 200 people dancing feverishly on a bridge until it collapsed. In the 1400s, more accounts of dancing frenzy were recorded, and well into the 17th century, there are descriptions of large groups of people breaking into similar maniacal dancing spurts that led to exhaustion and sometimes even death. An account written by a German writer later on in the 1800s described the mania like this. They formed circles hand in hand and, appearing to have lost all control over their senses, continued dancing for hours together in wild delirium until they fell to the ground in a state of exhaustion. They groaned as if in the agonies of death. The Black Plague. Why was this happening, and why was it happening for so long, over so many centuries? One of the answers is that these dancing plagues were reactions to trauma. The 1374 dancing outbreak came pretty soon after the Black Plague, which in the 1340s and 50s tore through Europe. Some estimates say nearly 60% of the total population of Europe was lost to the plague. Families were torn apart, the deceased piled up in the streets. It must have seemed as though humanity was being punished for some serious wrongdoings. The Black Plague no doubt created some serious psychological traumas for those who managed to survive it. These unhinged dancing parties have been explained as stemming from the horrors of the plague. Even the outbreaks that happened later in the 1500s have been explained by famines caused by the erratic flow of the Rhine River in Germany, and an outbreak of syphilis that ravaged the region. In all cases, extreme psychological distress could have led to people doing some pretty wild things. In Malaysia, the tribal practice of running amok has been widely documented. The phenomenon occurs when an individual goes on a spree, taking the lives of multiple people within his own tribe in the process. Despite being devastating to the tribal community, these individuals were often pardoned by the tribal councils, because the run amok spree was brought on by psychological disturbances like losing family members. The dancing plague, while not nearly as bad as running amok or our modern equivalents involving weapons and police, has been considered by psychologists and historians as similar as misguided expressions of traumatic events. Moldy bread? But there are also some other theories about what caused these dancing outbreaks. One has to do with moldy bread. Ergo is a psychotropic fungus that grows on rye breads. It is widely attributed to the hysteria that broke out in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1600s and became known as the Salem witch trials. Ingesting ergo can lead to hallucinations, spasms, and delusions, and could help explain the crazy dancing in parts of Central Europe. However, some have argued that a lot of the dancing plagues broke out in areas where the people didn't consume rye bread. Also, reports of maniacal dances occurred outside of the wet seasons, the time when the fungus is able to grow. The stamina and movements that many of the dancers had also led people to think that ergo wasn't the culprit. On ergo, there's very little chance that many of the revelers could have lasted so long and had the ability to move around in the ways they did. Another explanation has to do with a disease called Sydenham's chorea. Symptoms of Sydenham's chorea included involuntary twitching and jerking movements in the face, hands, and feet. It was caused by a bacterial infection during childhood and became associated with the dancing plagues later in the 18th century, when it was called Saint Vitus dance after a certain saint who was celebrated through dancing. The theory has been widely downplayed, though, as a lot of the chorea mania that occurred earlier included movements and behaviors that couldn't be explained solely through the symptoms of the disease. Condemned by the Church. Whatever the causes or reasons behind these dancing plagues, the Catholic Church certainly didn't like what was going on. Church officials attributed the dancing to demonic possession. They performed exorcisms on many of the revelers. During the 1374 outbreak, many of the dancers were basically taken to various churches, where they were punished or tied to the ground and doused with holy water, or literally just slapped until they came to their senses. The church even resorted to commissioning musicians to play music during the outbreaks, ordering them to slowly reduce the tempo as they played in the hopes that they could slow down the manic writhing raves to the point where the revelers could be brought back to their senses. Coordinated pilgrims. Some think that the dancing plagues weren't spontaneous outbreaks at all. There's evidence that a lot of the participants came from other regions, that they were pilgrims who practiced a very foreign form of Christianity. They seemed to worship the same saints, but did so in a very different way. Writing from the time of the dance plagues describes the people who started them as strange sects of Christians who were organized and knew what they were doing. Eventually, locals would join up, drawn in by the intoxicating moves, which gave the events more of a mad spin than they were originally. Others claim that the dancers were of Czech origin, specifically from the region of Bohemia. People from Bohemia